What's up, guys? Jake Shields here with John Danaher. A lot of people that watch my podcast might not know, but you're widely, or a lot of people consider you the best jiu-jitsu trainer currently and potentially of all time, and an amazing MMA trainer as well. You train greats like Gordon Ryan in jiu-jitsu, Gary Tonin in GSP, and Chris Weidman in MMA. Some, stood out the greats of all time. So we came straight to jiu-jitsu. So thanks for doing this.
My pleasure, Jake. It's good to see you.
Yes. So I'm going to get in. Let's start off before we get into jiu-jitsu. You're from New Zealand, correct?
Yes. I was born in the United States, and New Zealand, just to give a quick history lesson, in the 1960s, obviously America was involved in the Vietnam War. Australia and New Zealand, and I think South Korea were the few countries that actually fought alongside America in the Vietnam War. Most of America's traditional allies did not join America, but New Zealand and Australia had very close military ties to America because of events in World War II. So when Vietnam kicked off, New Zealand and Australia committed forces to the conflict. My father was a pilot in the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and he was given a station in Washington, D.C. He worked in the Pentagon in the 1960s, and I was born here in that time. Sometime after that, fairly short time, I was very young, we went back to New Zealand, and I was raised in New Zealand through the late 1960s, 1970s, and most of the 1980s.
Yeah, I did not know that. I don't think most Americans know much about the New Zealand, that they helped us and whatnot. Did you like New Zealand or not really?
I loved it. New Zealand's a truly beautiful country. I'm always eternally grateful that I was raised in New Zealand. I think there was a sense in which getting raised in New Zealand, especially in the 1970s, there was a kind of innocence to it where you grew up and we grew up very close to the ocean. There was forested land everywhere. New Zealand is a physically beautiful, beautiful country. And even though we were quite poor, we were rich in experience because I didn't care how much money you throw around. There is nothing that money can buy that is greater than natural beauty, the ocean, the southern sky at night, things like this. These are memories that I was truly blessed to have as a child.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, because I grew up with, no money or anything as well, but, poor financially, but in a beautiful area, and it makes it not seem that way, because we could go outside, do stuff. So let's switch it up real quick. So you went to Columbia on a philosophy, you were studying philosophy.
That's correct. I was in university in New Zealand, and because I was born in the United States, my father raised me with the idea that one day you'll become an American. And I was always curious about this land that I was born in. And when I was in the master's program in New Zealand, I applied to the PhD program at Columbia University. I was accepted, and I took off and found myself in the United States. New York was a place I'd been to for 2 weeks prior. I went there in the 1980s and had a look at it, loved it. And I arrived in New York City in 1991.
So you went from philosophy to jiu-jitsu instructor. Do you feel like that's a completely different path, or you feel like those are connected?
Well, the strange thing about philosophy is that it's of all the disciplines you can take in a university, it's probably the least specific. Like if you do electrical engineering, it's a very compartmentalized degree, whereas philosophy is very broad-based, and there's every aspect of life is touched by some aspect of philosophy. So I felt like it's so non-specific that it could apply to pretty much any avenue you take. And for me, I would say I learned in philosophy the idea that the questions you ask in any given enterprise are at least as important and quite possibly more important than the attempts at answers that you furnish. And philosophy gave me a questioning mind and an ability to take complex material, break it down into parts, and analyze, and hopefully furnish rational solutions to problems. And I'm eternally grateful for my study in philosophy. I made many foolish errors in my life, but probably the one smart thing I did was study philosophy at a young age.
Yeah, I feel like your style of jiu-jitsu and the way you come in, I feel it's very philosophical. So I don't feel like you really completely did a U-turn or a 180. I feel like it's very similar and kind of makes
I think
sense.
the ability to look at some enterprise that you're studying and break it down into first principles and then work from first principles is something which applies to any area in life that you care to choose. And that was really the gift that philosophy gave me when I entered jiu-jitsu.
So you came up through Renzo Gracie, which is in New York. What year did you start training?
1994. And
complete madhouse, or
yeah, when I first started jiu-jitsu, Renzo wasn't permanently in New York. He was living in Brazil. He would periodically come to the United States, but he had a friend who was teaching in New York City, who he was affiliated with. And when Renzo arrived, then he set up a school. The two of them set it up together. They eventually went separate ways, but Renzo, I stayed on with Renzo, and I must say the difference that it made when he arrived and people started training full time. But before that, there were 3 classes a week. You came in, it was an hour class, and you made progress, of course, but it wasn't until you had someone who was deeply passionate about 7 days a week training twice a day, and that just made an enormous difference to the people that trained there.
Yeah, I like how you say 7 days a week, twice a day, because I actually trained under you for like 2 years, and it was like serious. We trained 7 days a week. This is already past my athletic prime, but I was still in there 7 days a week, twice a day, 3 times a day. Sometimes people don't understand the dedication, and not many people do that.
I think if you want, it's pretty simple, really. If you want to be good at something in the least time possible, you have to immerse yourself in the activity. If you want to get good at language, you want to speak a language, go to that country where they speak that language and just live there. Get immersed in it. So literally every conversation you have 24/7 is in that language. You'll get good quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. That's what happened to me, completely absorbed in jiu-jitsu. And that's, I just do it, whatever I'm doing. And that's, if you want to be great at anything, it's not easy.
Yeah. A very formative influence on me as a child was my father. And he always used to say to me, John, I don't care what you do, just make sure you're good at it. And I think that that's wise advice, within reason. Of course, you don't want to be the best drug dealer in town, but if you are going to choose something, don't go in half-hearted. Like, choose wisely, and then go in with everything you've got.
Jiu-jitsu is my life, and I think you're the most obsessed person I've ever seen. You'd be at the gym, from like early morning till late night, in between teaching, and then you'd be watching videos. It's just, I would see you there just all day. It's truly insane.
There's a sense in which I'm the beneficiary of the work of my students, because my students compete at a very high level. Almost all of them are competing at the pinnacle of the sport, and have done for a very long time in various disciplines, whether it be mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu. All of them are deeply passionate about what they do. And I felt always that if I didn't live that lifestyle, I would be letting down people who I deeply cared about and people who were counting on me to help them. And there's a sense in which people say, oh, I'm obsessed with this. Well, you had to be if you just wanted to help these people achieve their dreams and goals. They're operating at a very high level where if I don't commit myself fully, then I'm not going to be much use to them.
It's that when I was in New York, even though I was past my athletic, my peak, I still felt like the need, because everyone's helping each other out. I felt like, oh, I need to be there helping guys out. If I was missed, I would be like, oh, I let my guys down. It's when you have that ability around each other with teammates helping raise each other up, it makes it way easier. And for you, I think you're not a guy who necessarily expresses yourself like in a kind way, but like the fact that you're always there helping people just shows that how much you really care.
Yeah, I've always
believed it. Cold.
But by nature, I'm a cold person. It's just my personality. I was always that way. I tend to be a cold person who lives according to rational principles rather than an emotional person. And but I've always believed that the people if you want to know who really cares about you in your life, don't listen to what people say. Because people say whatever they think they want you to hear. Watch what they do. And the people who care most about you are the ones who are always there, especially when things are bad. That's when you really get to see who your real friends are. And so, watch people's actions. And if someone's there always trying to help you, then it's clear that that's someone who cares about you, as opposed to someone who talks nice things, but as soon as things get rough, they're out the door.
You 100% nailed it. You might not say the kindest things, but anytime I need something from you, you're there. I'm kind of the same way. I have the same problem. I know sometimes I need to work on being nicer. People think I'm like cold, but it's just not. It's not my nature. So I can 100% relate. But yeah, back to the training. Well, interesting. Just popped my head a little off subject, but we actually, before we met, we were actually enemies. Not enemies, but
We
we
were
actually,
mortal
yeah,
enemies,
we were
Jake.
mortal enemies. So John actually trained George St. Pierre to fight me, and unfortunately win.
The whole lead up to George and both yourself and of course your great training partner Nick Diaz. It's kind of a fascinating thing when we look back on it, because you were fighting in different organizations. You two were fighting in Strikeforce. George was in UFC, but even then, even though you were in completely different organizations, there was always this sense of inevitability that both you and Nick would run into George at some point. You had accrued an incredible winning record. There was a period where you had gone years without,
I think like 7 years.
Yeah, 7 years. Like no one had defeated you. I remember you had an epic war with Dan Henderson, who was a weight division above you. At one point, I think you were unconscious in that fight. And
was
you came back
out cold and somehow woke up.
You woke up, and then 30 seconds later, you were mounted on him. I couldn't believe it. It was crazy. Nick Diaz, one of the toughest guys in the history of mixed martial arts, and I would study you guys because I just knew that at some point your paths would cross. And I remember when you went to the UFC, I think you fought Campman was your first match in the UFC. I remember watching that with George. And then it became clear that, okay, you guys were going to cross paths. And then Nick came back. UFC, I believe, bought Strikeforce. They bought it out. And then Nick was in the UFC. And then, so my first interaction with you was studying you on video to see how George would fight you and fight Nick.
Yeah, so it was so cool. Even though I fought George, I always respected him. So it was great that I was able to become friends with him at your gym afterwards.
Yes,
I remember I first watching your gym, I was like, am I going to be kicked out of here? But I nervously kind of walked in, and you right away greeted me. You were excited to see me, and I went and trained, and I was like, okay.
I still remember the night George fought Nick Diaz in Montreal. We had a run-in over because you guys were coming into the locker room, and I think you were asking to check George's gloves, and then I had to go into Nick's room and check his gloves, and so I thought it was funny when you came in, and I'm not one to hold grudges, and you came in, and I've always admired your grappling ability. When I started you, I thought this kid's he's very, very well trained in mixed martial arts grappling. And the irony, of course, is that when you and George train together, your grappling styles are extraordinarily similar. Both of you take down, step into half guard, pressure pass from half guard, get to the mounted position. You both favor guillotines as your primary submission from bottom position. You're both very strong in Kimura. And so when you guys train with each other, it was hilarious for me to watch in the gym because you're literally like carbon copies, and whoever got on top would dominate, and there was a scramble to not be in bottom position.
Feeling his guard pass was like, oh, this is exactly what I do. And on top of me, I'm like, this is so hard to stop.
It was funny. Insane. You guys were laughing after the session because I think we did a guard passing sparring round, a positional round. And I think you passed him 6 times and he passed you 6 times. And I remember just laughing with the 3 of you afterwards. And those, those are special moments in martial arts that we're guys, we have these temporary rivalries, and then you figure out at the end of it that we have way more in common than we do.
Exactly.
There's so many more reasons to form a friendship than there is to stay with a rivalry. The rivalries are important because they build your character. They elevate your profile. Without, if it was all just friendship, life would be boring. But I must say the best feelings come from when an old rivalry is replaced by friendship.
No, you're right. That felt really cool. And another interesting thing with George, I remember I was in New York one time visiting, and there was a huge snowstorm. And naturally, I just went to the gym. I walked in. It was me, you, and George St. Pierre, the only people. It was usually 100 people. And Gordon couldn't get there because he had to drive, and Gary, so they had to drive like 3 hours. They couldn't get there, but not a single other person had came over a snowstorm. That just completely shocked me. I was completely blown away. 100 people didn't come because of a snowstorm.
Imagine if you had a time machine and you could go back and tell you when you were getting ready to fight George St. Pierre, hey, 8 years from now, you're going to be in a gym, just you, John and George in a snowstorm,
Coaching us both.
and having fun doing jiu-jitsu training, you would be like, get out of here, this is crazy. And yet it happened.
Yeah, no, it's a crazy life between, it's can be extremely serious and harsh at times and also extremely fun.
Yeah.
And you've actually had, I mean, you're an amazing coach, but you've also had some amazing students walk in. George St. Pierre, Gary Tonin, Gordon Ryan. You have to have, that's not luck, but it's pretty amazing to have those guys walk into your gym.
Yes. I will say this straight. For anyone who's listening to this podcast, whatever minor successes I've had in my life have come entirely because of the work of my students, their dedication, their hard work, and their courage. Were it not for my students, no one ever would have heard my name. So I owe pretty much everything that I have to my students. That's why I give so much to them, because they've given so much to me. And without them, I would be nothing more than an old cripple in a basement playing around with some silly ideas.
You're an amazing technician, and you set the environment, but you need the students too.
Absolutely.
You have amazing, not everyone's loyal, but like, Gordon, Gary, GSP have been extremely loyal and done so much.
It's a pleasure to teach. And one of the great pleasures for me as a coach is seeing someone getting noticeably better, and the joy and the increase in confidence that they gain when they start to think that goals that maybe seemed impossible originally suddenly become very probable. To give you a concrete example, the first time George went to fight Matt Hughes for a title, he was rushed into it. There weren't many people in the welterweight division at that time. He was a rising star. They pushed him quickly into a title fight, and he went into that fight just absolutely not believing he could win it. But then solid training over time, and then the acquisition of new skills. And he went into the second fight not believing that he would win, but knowing that he would win. And then seeing that change in character when he went into the second fight, and then the extraordinary joy and happiness when he attained his goal, and how that translated into his family life, how his mother was there. His father at the time was very sick, and he went home with a UFC belt, presented it to his father, and you just see what can come out of building someone up and getting them to their aspirations and their dreams and their goals. And so it's a wonderful feeling. The joy you get out of that, I believe, is far greater than joy you get from something you do alone or privately.
Yeah. Do you have, I heard stories you were an absolute killer in the gym, but you've dealt with a lot of injuries. Do you feel like, I don't know the proper word, but like remorse or regret that you weren't able to become a top athlete yourself?
Not really. I've had people who should know I had a crippled leg for most of my life, and that put you can. Right now I'm seated, but if you saw me stand or walk, you would see these things. And as I've gotten older, of course, it's gotten worse. But no, there's never been a time where I thought, man, I wish that I.
So even early on, it didn't bother you too bad?
Yeah, by nature, I'm not someone who seeks the limelight or something like that. And I'm happy to live through my students.
No, I mean, that's great. But I mean, David Terrell, who's an absolute killer, he said he spoke extremely highly of you, and he didn't speak highly of most people. So I'm like, okay, John must have been, obviously your technique's insane, but you must have been a killer on the mat too.
I'm proud that whenever my sensei, Renzo Gracie, told me to go with someone all the way up to world championship level, I always made him proud. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, back training under Renzo, that guy's a wild man, extremely charismatic and funny. But I imagine that gym was it pretty nuts back in the day?
It was a fun place. You must remember, you would know this as well as anyone, Jake, but most people now, when they go into jiu-jitsu is, everyone knows what it is. And a guy coming into his first day in class in jiu-jitsu now has typically seen UFCs. He knows what the basic idea of jiu-jitsu is, and he goes in believing that jiu-jitsu is a serious martial art, and it's right up there with wrestling, boxing is one of the major components of modern mixed martial arts. They've typically seen jiu-jitsu matches on YouTube, so they don't go in naive. In the 1990s, when I started, my God, people, you'd get literal lunatics coming into the gym and saying this is all bullshit. I will fight anyone in this gym. And you would have crazy challenge matches. Well, some people were training over here. There would be a fight over here. It was maniacal. And So there were some great stories. Yeah, I remember they just like every day there'd be something, and even the places we trained. When Renzo first came to New York, he had no money, so one of the first gyms that we had was in a condemned building that was owned by some extremely shady Chinese operatives, which appeared to have links to organized crime. And we went up. There was like this a man who had to be in his 90s who would operate one of those old elevators from the 1930s, where you need an operator who cranks an elevator. The door is manually closed, and you go up and you go on the fifth floor, and there's a bunch of people trying to kill each other on the mat. It was just amazing. Then we went to a kung fu school, which used to lease out floor space to all martial arts. So there would be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the corner. Then you would have ninjutsu next to that. Then you would have like Wing Chun Kung Fu. Then you would have boxing. Then you have Krav Maga. Just literally every martial art working out at the same time. And all of them despised each other. So, the Wing Chun guys hated the karate guys. And the karate guys thought boxing was bullshit. And no one had anything good to say about anybody, but the only thing that united all the other martial arts was how much they hated jiu-jitsu, because jiu-jitsu at the time was
like the king.
It was kind of doing very well in mixed martial arts, so there was that universal hatred of jiu-jitsu. And at one point, so many students were doing jiu-jitsu in comparison to the other martial arts that all the other martial arts banded together and insisted to the owner of the Kung Fu school that a giant black curtain be put around us so that we couldn't be seen.
Curtain of shame.
And I remember one night I was wrestling with one of my training partners, and we exploded right through the curtain, twisting through, like we literally can't even see each other. We're engulfed in a black curtain right into the middle of a ninja class. And I remember some of the ninjas like pulling the curtain, and I'm still trying to strangle this guy as we're inside the curtain, and a bunch of ninjas just looking at us. It was just like you couldn't even make the stuff up. That used to happen. But crazy times. I'll never forget those experiences.
Yes, you were there earlier than me in New York. I think people don't believe some of my stories sometimes. I'm trying to tell them how different it was. People come in from prison for challenge matches. Then obviously a lot of times I'd be the guy to get picked. Like, all right, Jake, fight that guy.
I remember one of my first private classes when Renzo had me start teaching. I'm teaching a guy, and you want to build some kind of rapport with the guy. So I'm asking him a few questions, how you been? What do you do? And he goes, I haven't really been around for a long time. And I go, you've been overseas? He goes like, no, I've been in prison. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. What did you do? And he goes like, I murdered someone. I was just like, oh, okay. Excellent. Yeah. And so let's work on that elbow escape. But yeah, just absolute lunatics would show up. I remember one time I was sitting next to a cop who used to train with us, and he was pointing out on the mat how many people he had arrested on this mat. And he goes like, this guy deals over here. This guy works up on, this guy's up on the Upper West Side. And he's just pointed out. And I was, because when someone works in daytime in New York, that means they don't have a regular job. So you're getting like cops and criminals and bouncers and maniacs. Drug dealers. Yeah. So the daytime classes were always my favorite. That's when you see the highest concentration of lunatics.
Yeah, we had a lot of lunatics in jiu-jitsu, but we all blend together pretty well somehow. I don't know how. I guess because you beat each other up.
It's interesting how you can take the most disparate group of people. You can have doctors, lawyers next to drug dealers and strippers, and yet if you give them a unified sense of a pursuit that they're all interested in, they will form friendships and allegiances that they would never have formed in any other aspect of life. And so the guy who is the $700 an hour lawyer can call the guy who cleans the streets outside one of his best friends and interact with them in that environment because they have this shared interest in this art. And it builds a unity in people, which is it's impressive to behold. There's also another idea of shared suffering. Shared suffering brings people together. I mean, it's hard to suffer things alone, but it's a lot easier to suffer in as a team. And all grappling, whether it be wrestling or judo or jiu-jitsu, it's hard work, and there's a lot of physical discomfort that comes with it. And when you get that sense of shared suffering towards a cherished goal, it builds very strong camaraderie. And you'll see people that would normally never even talk to each other become very good lifelong friends.
No, I couldn't agree more. It's that brings people together, whether it's wrestling, like you said, jujitsu, fighting. It brings these bonds that in the real world would make no sense. People you would
Yeah.
not expect to be friends, but doesn't make a difference. You could see like just the craziest connections. But that's why I encourage everyone to do it. So you were in New York. Was the crime cleaned up by the time you got there, or were you there when it was bad?
The year I arrived, 1991, was the peak year for murders in New York City history. So when I first went there in 1988, just to have a look at it, it was pretty crazy. 1991 through 92, 93 was the last years of the Dinkins administration, and they had a pretty laissez-faire approach to street crime. So there was street crime was very prevalent. There was also fairly widespread corruption and government jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So a guy, Rudolph Giuliani, was elected on a fairly conservative platform, I think in the mid or just prior to the mid-1990s. And he brought in a police inspector who I believe was originally from Boston, a guy called Bratton. And they started a kind of very strict policing policy. It was controversial, and to this day, I think it's still controversial. You'll hear people speak good things of it and bad things of it. Like anything in life, there's always two sides to the story. But one thing is clear, that the crime stats in New York, they can't be contested. The murder rate plummeted. Street crime in general went down a lot, and the character of the city changed a lot. I'm not going to lie, I liked the old criminal New York. Yeah. It was an exciting place to be in. I worked in nightclubs through both eras, and New York was an exciting place to be in the early 1990s. It was more violent. There's no getting around that fact. You could do things in the city then which you couldn't even conceive of doing today. Like if you had a problem with someone, you just fought, and you can't do that in a city now where cameras are everywhere and things like this. So it was an exciting time, and the city got cleaned up. I remember one time I was working in a club, and I came out at like 5:30 in the morning. The sun was coming up, and I had to walk home. I didn't want to spend money on a cab. I had very little money at that time, so I walked home, and part of the walk took me through 42nd Street. Now, 42nd Street, when I arrived in New York, was just a madhouse. There were things going on there that it looked like Sodom and Gomorrah when you would walk through there. And I remember walking through on a Sunday morning, and it was just straight up empty, nothing. And all the street stores were just boarded up. Someone had just bought them out. I believe it may have actually been Disney Corporation, but I'm not sure of this. But someone had bought them out, boarded them up, and it was just straight up empty, and everything was closed. And I remember being struck by this. And then 2 years later, the transformation of 42nd Street, it went from like straight up criminal enterprises to a pretty respectable tourist destination. The turnaround of New York, what was most shocking about it was how quickly it occurred. Like New York went from a very dangerous city to a very safe city in a very, very short period of time. I believe in 1991, the total number of people murdered was well over 1,000.
Wow.
And since then, it's never been over like 330. So that's a massive drop, and street crime overall went down accordingly.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast it can drop, because when I was there, it seemed so safe.
Yeah, it was very safe. 1996 up to 2019, it was extraordinarily
Girls could even walk around by themselves at night. It was insane. Do you miss New York? I think we're the only people that liked it out of all of our friends. Like I liked it, you liked it. It's weird, right? Everyone's hated it.
Yeah, no. All of my students despised New York. They hated it. And I remember sticking up for New York. I love that city. I miss New York every day. And New York was a great American city, but it was also a great international city. It was one of the most international cities I've ever lived in. And I loved it all of my time in New York. I loved it when it was dirty and grungy and criminal. I loved it when it was cleaned up. I loved it through economic strong times like the mid 1990s and 2013 onwards. I loved it through bad economic times, 2008 and 2000. I saw massive changes in every aspect, and it was a great and beautiful city, and I loved it the entire time. Most of my best friends still live in New York, and yeah, I miss it a lot.
Yeah, I think most of my listeners hate New York, but I loved it. I remember I visited, and then I just love the city, and I went and trained with you guys and everyone. I love the environment, and I'm like, you know what? Why don't I just move out here?
Yeah. I think a lot of people have bad opinions of New York without going there.
Good point.
And of the people who do go there that have bad opinions, they often go for very short periods of time. Now, if you go to a city for 1 week or 2 weeks, if you just have 3 or 4 bad experiences, you're going to hate that city. Mm-hmm. You haven't lived there long enough to really get a taste for it. You don't know a city until you've been there for at least a year. And, if I judged New York on my first week of experience in New York, I would have hated it.
Good point.
But like all good things in life, the more you know about it, the better it seems.
Yeah. It definitely has bad things too. And a lot of your students were commuting in. These guys were commuting like 2.5 hours.
Yeah, the problem with my students is they didn't live in New York. They lived in New Jersey. So the only thing they saw of New York was the commute in through the New Jersey Turnpike and the tunnels. That's just awful. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And, you're coming in midwinter, it's freezing cold, it's dark outside, and there's just, cars piled up as far as the eye can see. That's a terrible experience. And it's an expensive experience. Think about Gary, Gordon, and Nikki and the kids. They had no money at all. They were coming in this expensive city, costing them, $45 a day just to park. And
2.5 hour commute.
Dude, it's terrible.
And that's not even a nice part of the gym's not a nice part of the city.
Henzo's in a pretty rundown part of the city. So so I totally understand why they didn't like it. But I, on the other hand, I lived in Manhattan, and there's a big difference.
Yeah, I know. I loved it too. Were you there during 9/11?
Yes.
How was that?
It was a very strange day, and the aftermath was even stranger. I was working at a gym teaching jiu-jitsu, and the day it occurred, it was a beautiful blue sky day, and I was in a gym, which is kind of a swanky gym, and I would teach jiu-jitsu there. And one morning I was working out with a regular client, and I looked over, and a bunch of people were watching a TV, and I thought to myself, man, what lazy people. They're here in the gym and they're watching TV. They should be lifting weights and working out. And I looked over, and then literally everyone was watching the TV. So I finished grappling and I walked over, and the first film was coming out of the first building having been hit, and they were reporting it as though a small plane had hit the World Trade Center. Now I'm looking at the screen, and it's a beautiful sunny day. There's no cloud, there's no high winds, and a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And they're saying, oh, I think maybe like a Cessna hit the plane. First of all, the World Trade Center is built very, very well. And people don't understand the glass that they use in those high-rise towers. No Cessna is flying through that glass. It's going to bounce right off. And secondly, in that kind of perfect weather, the only way a plane hits a building is deliberately.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at this going, that ain't no Cessna, and that ain't no accident. And at that exact moment, the second plane went in. And then people started screaming, running around. The building that we were in was a high-rise building, and the authorities put out an order that all buildings above a certain height had to be evacuated. So we were kicked out of the building, and I walked home because the subways, the number 1 and 9 line had been cut because it went through the World Trade Center. So that was out of operation. So I walked back to my place. Cell phones at that moment were just completely overloaded and weren't working. I didn't actually have a cell phone in those days, but I went back and I used a landline, and I was calling people who I knew worked in the police force. They were my students, and most of them were out going to the area. And then I made my way down to the World Trade Center and had a look at what was going on. At that point, there was no cordon put around. That wasn't until later, so you could get relatively close. And the closer you got, the more it was dominated by this crazy gray ash that came down like snow, and people were walking out from the area. It was clear that something truly dreadful had happened, and as evening fell, they cleared the area out, and people came in and started to demarcate it as a disaster area. But yeah, it was a shocking event, and it had the effect of unifying New York. There was more unity and sense of purpose in New York City in the 3 to 6 months immediately after 9/11 than any other time, which I experienced in New York City. It was New York City is always, it's so diverse that of course it's heavily fractionalized. Everyone's sort of at each other's throats at all times, but there was more unity and sense of purpose then than any other time I saw in New York. And so it was both a terrible tragedy and at the same time something very inspirational. And for me, as someone who's a New Zealander but also an American, it was deeply impressive to me how unified the Americans became at that time. And it was the first time I really saw like the strength of American patriotism. It was deeply impressive.
Yeah, obviously it was more intense in New York, but that was intense watching from California, and it brought people, even California brought Americans together. That was such an intense, crazy moment.
Yeah, that was a very strange day. A lot of strange things happened that day.
Yeah, I know, definitely a heavy thing, especially for living there. Let's switch back to martial arts, something fun. With GSP, the one fight towards the end of his career, well, he won 2 titles, went up and beat 70s, then he beat Bisping. But then they were talking about both him and Khabib wanted to fight each other. That was a fight I really wanted to see. I trained with them both, so I'm not going to weigh in on opinions. I think that'd be rude, but I just think that was the one fight that I wish they'd done before they both walked away.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
With George, there's always the question of what would have happened if he fought Anderson Silva and what would have happened if he fought
Silva too would be great.
So they were both enormous fights. And the Anderson Silva one would have been interesting. Obviously, Anderson Silva would have had a huge size advantage. But I've seen George in training put down people a lot bigger than Anderson Silva and do it pretty easily. I've seen him spar UFC champions at 205 and 185 and put them down very regularly and hard sparring. So there's no question he could have put him down, but on the other hand, Anderson Silva could have hit him with a knee or front kick before he got in. So it would have been a fascinating match. With Khabib, that would have been more complex because that would have been very much at the end of George's career. It would have gone years after the end of George's career. So then you got the whole question of, well, would that have been peak George or would that have been 4 years past his prime George?
He was still, he's probably past his prime, but he was still phenomenal shape, training a lot. But even a couple of years past your prime, I guess can make a difference. But
I think when you talk about the greats of mixed martial arts, there's so many incredibly talented athletes. But for me personally, the 3 greatest MMA fighters of all time will always be George, Jon Jones, and Khabib. And there are many other outstanding people. There's people like Anderson Silva, Fedor, Sakuraba, even people that most people wouldn't put in the conversation. I always put BJ Penn in this conversation. I thought he was an amazing fighter. I think he was badly managed. I think his career was harmed by bad judgment, but in terms of just pure fighting talent, I put him way up there. But for me, George, Khabib, and Jon Jones will always be the big 3. And which one you go for is going to come down to criteria because they have some similarities. All 3 of them defeated every single person they ever fought. George lost twice, but he won decisively against both people in the rematches. So he fought and beat everyone he ever fought.
I didn't realize that. You mentioned that.
Jon Jones ostensibly has a loss on his record, but it's not a real
the guy
loss.
out. Yeah, he knocked the guy out when he lost, which is I can't believe the amount of people that hate on Jon Jones. The guy's like he's done some dumb things, but he's a spectacular fighter,
amazing, incredible fighter. We're just talking about their fighting skill.
Yeah.
Khabib, everyone criticizes him. They say, oh, well, his first 15, 20 fights were against nobodies. Well, that's true, but the thing about Khabib is when he did in those last 5 fights fight the best guys in the world, he just got better and better and better. Like it wasn't like he had an easy matches for the first 20 fights, and then when he fought the tough guys, it was razor close. He got more dominant as his opponents got better and better. So I have a lot of respect for that guy's ability. Interestingly, all 3 of them have a roughly similar fighting style, which is based around the ability to take an opponent down without being taken down themselves, and do most of their best work with ground and pound on the floor, which tells you something. If all 3 of the best guys of all time have that style, and you want to ask yourself, what's the best style to work with, there's a lesson there. All 3 of them had very long and very successful careers. They had great longevity. They got through their careers with very little damage. That you don't see any CTE injuries in any of them. They fought smart, tactical fights. They hit a lot.
Yeah, they don't hit very much.
They took relatively little damage. It just tells you just what an impressive fighting style, a style based around the ability to close distance effectively, put someone down on the ground, get top position, and employ striking technique on the ground. It's just a very effective strategy. It's very hard to deal with. But those 3, amazing. Interestingly, I've seen Jon Jones and George St. Pierre train together in full sparring, and it's not polite to talk about it, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests George would have done very, very well against heavier opponents. With Khabib, the whole question is, do we do this as a time machine thought experiment where peak George fights peak Khabib, or is it George at age 40 fighting Khabib? But all 3 of them, those 3 will always get my vote as the best of all time.
And what's great is Jon Jones is still currently the champion, and your student's actually been going out helping him with jiu-jitsu. So it shows he's still learning, and still Gordon Ryan, he's still learning, still absorbing.
Jon Jones will always be one of the most amazing people I met in mixed martial arts. I remember the first time I met him was when UFC 100 was on, and I was there with George. George was the co-main event. Brock Lesnar was the main event of UFC 100. And when fight week began, we went in on a Tuesday night for George's first workout. The first night, the room which the UFC had allocated for the athletes was absolutely packed. And you had to wait to go out onto the mat to go out and train. So you had, like Michael Bisping was training over here, and various people. It's always fun when you get an international crowd, because you see the training styles of different countries are very different. Everyone has their own approach to training and preparation. And so I'm sitting next to Faraz Sahabi, and George is with us, and he's warming up and he's waiting for his turn on the mat. Finally, we finished. The workout was good. And in comes a very young Jon Jones. Now, Jon Jones fought on the undercard. He was, I think it was like his 2nd or 3rd fight in the UFC. So he was like this very talented youngster who was on the undercard. And he came in alone, and he was looking for a training partner. Now, Mark Coleman was on that card, and he was a former Pride champion, and he was at the late stage of his career. And he comes in alone, and he's looking for a training partner. And Jon Jones, Mark Coleman is a legend. He was like Pride champion and champions. Yeah, he was like, all the youngsters looked up to him. And Jon Jones came up and he started asking, the legend Mark Coleman some questions. Now, he was asking him a question about how to finish a single leg takedown, and he goes, I have this problem. I'm holding this way, and they're using wrist control, and they're stopping me from completing. Mark Coleman just looks at him. He goes, switch to a double. And he goes, yeah, I can't do that because they're holding my wrist. And Mark Coleman looks at him and goes, switch to a double. And he goes, yeah, but what if he's pressuring down and I can't bring my head up? He goes like, switch to a fucking double. and everyone's just like this. So Jon Jones was like, oh, can I put you in? And Mark Coleman goes, yeah. And then he starts on a single leg and just 100% explodes from a single leg into a double leg. Jon Jones has the reflexes of a cat. He's very, very agile, and he defends it. They just start sprinting across the mat. People are just fleeing. It's like the Red Sea just opens up in front of these two maniacs who are just going at it. No, it's a Tuesday night. These guys are both fighting on Saturday night. So they are just going, they go straight into a concrete wall and just go all over the mat, knocking people over. Chaos breaks out. It turns into World War fucking III. And we're just looking at each other. For us, Harvey and I just look at each other like, this is really happening. And George is going, this is madness. This is madness. And they had like a 5-minute war of all wars. And
it's supposed to be the drill before a fight.
Yeah, it's like we're supposed to be doing like light drilling, like 5 days before a fight. And then they just emptied the entire gym, and then they're both completely exhausted. That was their workout. And the next night we came in, literally no one was in that room. They just had an empty room. Everybody stayed away from the lunatics. Then on Wednesday night, everyone came back, and they came back and had a second World War III, this time only 3 days away from a fight. It was amazing. Awesome. Like you would never see that kind of thing happen in a modern, everyone's too professional now. Like everyone's too well-educated, too professional, but just crazy stuff would happen. But every time I met Jon Jones, I was very impressed. I remember teaching a seminar, and he was part of it. It was a MMA seminar. I was teaching the Jiu Jitsu part of it. He was teaching what he does, and physically, he's a truly impressive specimen. Hyper flexible. He really uses his reach well. He's a very, very impressive fellow. And the fact that, again, check out the longevity in his career.
That's just so impressive.
It's incredible.
He's been fighting forever, and he's still looking
so
dominant
impressive.
too. His last couple of fights at heavyweight, he looks so impressive. Everyone trying to say he's scared of that up and comer who's amazing, but he's not scared. He just wants to get paid.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he realizes he doesn't have that many fights left. He wants to be compensated, and if anyone deserves to be compensated, it's that guy.
Yeah, he's been on top.
He's been carrying the flag of the UFC for so long, and so many people say, his last fight, he didn't look that dominant. Well, interesting. When we go back to those 3 all-time greats, they share another commonality insofar as there's at least one fight in their career where everyone believes that they lost. Like George often gets criticized when he fought Hendricks. You say, Hendricks won that fight. Khabib is often criticized when he fought the tough Brazilian kid.
I know what you're talking about. I can't think of the name.
It was very close, and you could argue that the other guy won. John had a tough fight, and he's had a couple of fights where the decision was very, very close. And, there's always going to be this. There's always going to be, he lost that fight. But these guys were established champions. To take them out of their reign, you got to come in and do something very dominant. And but Jon Jones, man, what amazing longevity. What an amazing athlete. And it's a privilege just to still be watching him now. And after all these years, and still doing so well.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like him for some reason, but I don't really know him that well. But like ran into him recently, he went way out of his way, walk over, say hi, extremely friendly.
He's always been very
good to me.
Yeah. I've never had a bad experience with him. He's, I'm not going to say I know him, but he's always seemed like a gentleman to me. I remember one time it was funny. He was getting ready to fight Rashad Evans, and it's fight week. I was there, and I was working with one of my athletes, and he comes up to me and goes, hey John, can you show me how to do an armbar? And I'm like, yeah, of course. So I show him how to do an armbar from guard position. Now John's a wrestler. I think there's very few times he's been taken down in his career, and the amount of time he's spent working from bottom position has been very, very low. So the fight with Rashad Evans was a pretty emotional fight for those guys because they were good friends for a long time. And then you know,
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that bad
it
blood
got
thing.
pretty
Yeah.
heated between them, and
I could
that
tell
wasn't
the
fake.
fighter, an old friend. Yeah, no, that
they
wasn't fake.
yeah they would definitely had some issues. So so he's going, you know, okay, show me how to do that, and I'm showing it now. Jon Jones is one of the most impressive, athletically gifted human beings you'll ever work out with, and within a very short time, he's doing pretty well with the armbar from guard. And he goes to me, "I'm going to win the fight with this move." Now it's Tuesday night. The fight's on Saturday. I'm like, "John, that's not a good idea." I go, like, you know, new moves, you need time to incorporate them. They have to be brought into your repertoire. It's not smart just to go out there and do the move. And he's like, no, I'm going to win the fight with this. I'm like, no, I think that's a bad idea. So I see Mr. Jackson is in the room. I walk up and I go, Greg, John asked me to show him how to do an armbar from guard. And now he's saying he's going to win the fight with it. You better have a word to him. And he's like, oh, fuck. So
good luck convincing him.
So he comes over and he's like, you know, armbars are great. They're awesome moves. Love them. But don't really want to be fighting this fight on your back. And John's like, no, it's not going to be an issue. I'm just going to pull guard.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, John, you've never pulled guard in your life in a fight. This is not the fight to be doing this. And he's like, absolutely, I'm going to do it. And I remember I remember watching the fight, just terrified that he was going to come out and pull close guard of all things. And I'm watching the fight, and I think it was either the end of round 1 or round 2, but at some point he did jump close guard. Thank God there was only like 5 seconds left in the match, but he jumped guard and he didn't go to the armbar, so it didn't come out. But there was a period where he actually jumped close guard, I think, on an opponent in an MMA fight. But that was John. He didn't give a fuck. He's
a lunatic.
But that kind of self-belief, it's impressive.
Oh, it's impressive. And Gordon said his ability to adapt and change is like really impressive.
Yeah, I remember Gordon texting me the first night. Yeah, he said exactly that. He said, man, I can see why this guy's a champion. He goes, like, I show him something and he's on it, and then he can improvise off of it. He said he's not just following the rules. I'll show him something, he's improvising off that. He said he's a very, very creative person. George was also very impressed when he trained with him. But Gordon had nothing but good things to say about him. He's very, very impressed.
Yeah, as a coach, if you could show someone a move, you know, I coach like part-time, you know, if I show someone a move and they can take that move and add to it, improvise, that's when you're like, wow, this is great.
Yeah.
I have one kid I train who can just instantly show himself, and then he's doing it differently, but correct. Usually you want your students to do exactly how you tell them originally or in the beginning, but there's some guys who can take it and add to it. And you're like, wow, that's so great.
The goal of a really good coaching program is never to create robots. It's to create intuitive athletes who can improvise according to their own measure and logic. And so you never want to give students all the answers, and you never want to, as it were, program them or micromanage them. You want to introduce them to scenarios and get them thinking in terms of first principles, and ask them, you know, what is the problem here? And then have them research a problem. And that's when they start figuring things out for themselves. People will remember a solution to a problem that they came up with 100 times better than any solution that you came up with. They'll forget 90% of what you show them, but they will remember every breakthrough that they made on their own accord. Those are the formative moments, and you have to guide students towards those formative moments. Your role as a coach is more to be a muse to your students, where you provoke them into thought and put them into scenarios and generate experiences where they can figure out solutions for themselves, even if it means pushing them in the right direction, but never just spoon feeding them. When you spoon feed them, when you're not there, you're not going to progress.
Yeah, I think that's why I loved right away I clicked with your coaching style, because you were very precise when you're showing the moves, but you give a ton of freedom to do things differently. And you realize, like, I'm not going to move exactly how Gordon or Gary move. And you adjust. And I've seen you change things, how you do things yourself. You'll find a better way to do things. You don't get stuck on the dogma of this is how you do the move. Yeah. You'll find, I found a better way to do something.
Yeah. No, the minute you start thinking you've got all the answers, you're in trouble.
Things change.
Yeah. And there's always a better way. And even if you look at my students, when the first students came out, they were known mostly as leg lockers in a world where not many people were effective leg lockers. But if you look at my students, all of them had there was a unity of purpose. They were leg lockers, but the way they expressed that was quite unique to each one of them. Gary was focused mostly on standing entries into leg locks. Eddie was more interested in bottom position entries into leg locks. Gordon was also bottom position, but he focused more on outside, Eddie more on inside. Nicky had a style more similar to his brother. So they worked, there was a unity insofar as they were engaged in the same project, but their individual expression was all very different. And that's a healthy thing. You don't want everyone just to be the same, or just to approach the problem with a kind of group think. You want everyone thinking independently.
Yeah, I see a lot of coaches that try to make all their guys do exactly what they do. They're like they're having some big guy pull guard when the coach is like a tall, long leg guy, and he's teaching them the same. I'm just like, oh, this is not good.
Yeah.
You have to adapt to your body type, what you are, and you were very good at that.
At the end of the day, remember, never lose track of the fact that it's a martial art. It's an artistic expression, and like any art form, it's highly individualistic, and you must always keep that in mind.
I think in the beginning, you want to give like the fundamentals. This is how you do things. But then as you get advanced, it's like the rules don't really necessarily follow. Like when we came up in jiu-jitsu, remember, it was like never give your back, never do all this stuff, bring the choke to the choke side, all this stuff. A lot of the best guys are doing completely different now.
And a lot of the dogma, those simple principles turned out historically to be quite incorrect.
A lot of us are doing the opposite of how we were taught now.
You got to ask yourself, like, how much research really went into those principles? And what you typically find is that they're taught because they were taught to someone else, and that person was taught by another person, and they just passed down. And at no point does anyone actually expose those principles to rigorous testing. But rigorous testing that's the great purveyor of truth. And without trial and error, you don't really know if it's correct. And even worse is a situation where you have a move which is adequate, because then you'll keep it on because it's good enough, but it may not be optimal. Just because it works doesn't mean it's not a better alternative. And we get very complacent when things are working. We say, oh, it's working. Don't fix what's not broke. But if you're always looking for that new performance level, you got to test everything, even your most cherished principles.
Yeah, even the couple years I trained with you, you'd be showing something, and maybe 6 months later, you'd be showing the move completely different. You come up with something that you thought was a better way to do it. I think that's you're always staying ahead of the curves. Like I came there when the leg lock was the huge trend, and you were already moving away from that. We weren't doing that for leg locks. You're like, oh yeah, that time we've already got our leg locks. We're still doing them, but it wasn't your main focus anymore. And everyone else was leg lock, leg lock, leg lock.
Yeah, it's the easiest victories are when you're using technology that your opponents don't even understand. And it would be hard to go in just with leg locks now and win a tournament. It's going to be tough. You've always got to have some weapon in your repertoire which your opponents don't fully comprehend or understand. And it's easy to defend things when you know all the defenses. But if you don't even know what they're trying on you, very hard to defend. So staying ahead of the curve it's an important thing.
Yeah, I think leg locks were way underused. Now I think they're way overused. Would you agree or no?
I think it's starting to even out now, and
it's pushing away a little bit.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing now is that people use leg locks tactically rather than as a submission hold, and you can use the threat of leg locks to generate off balances and movement, which leads into other moves like the ability to wrestle up from bottom position, to feed off into upper body submissions, or just create scrambles. But it's not 2011 anymore. You can't just come in with leg locks and just
leg lock.
So they're used much more tactically now.
Yeah, no, I guess I haven't watched jiu-jitsu in the last 6 months, but there was a phase where all everyone was doing is just sitting and trying to leg lock each other. And I was like, all right, this is getting kind of lame.
Yeah. Anything that's overused it's always a problem.
Yeah, that's what happens. Something becomes trendy, and then people put too much time learning it. Before they didn't do enough, then they're doing too much. And I think you're right, though. I think it's evening out now. I don't watch that much jiu-jitsu anymore, just occasionally. Let's talk real quick about Gary Tonin. He's phenomenal. I don't think he's been getting the respect he deserves lately because he hasn't been fighting in the US, but he's probably, you could say, maybe the most exciting grappler ever. Extremely loyal, hardworking. Are you allowed to say what's up with this contract situation, or is that
I don't believe it's wise to talk about it because it's I'm no expert on contracts. I leave that up to that's for lawyers. I'm a jiu-jitsu coach, but I'm not someone who's conversant with law or contracts. So my students, when they have contracts, they just do that independently, usually with legal advice. But he hasn't fought in a year. And,
that's terrible.
Yeah. So he's been relatively inactive. So hopefully they can get whatever contractual problems they have sorted out.
Yeah, I would love to see him fight in the UFC or getting paid good and using him a lot over in ONE FC because he's just so talented, so exciting. Just, like I said, such a hard worker too.
No, he's a great guy.
His work ethic's insane.
And he's maintained that for so long, you know.
It's impressive.
But he's also a great team player too. I remember when all the youngsters would come in. They were so young when they started. He would pick everyone up at 5 o'clock in the morning and drive everyone into Manhattan and make sure they were there for morning class to train. So he's a good person.
Yeah, no, he's such a good person. It was such a magical time when I was there. He'd round those guys up. Gordon, when I first came in, I trained with Gordon. I think he was 18 years old. He was a purple belt. I'm like, oh, who's this kid? He was tough. I mean, I beat him up, but it was just like, I'm like, this is a tough purple belt. And I came back like 6 months later, and it was like, I was like barely beating him. And then 6 months later, it was like we'd evened out. And then like he passed me. It's like, what the hell? I'd never seen anyone excel that quick.
No, it's an amazing thing. The progress of all those guys is just outstanding. And I'm very proud of everything they've accomplished. But let me tell you, they worked hard for it. And,
the work ethic was insane.
Yeah.
And like I said, people don't realize they were driving. If you want to make something happen, you'll make it happen. They were driving 2.5 hours every day. And then Gary was teaching at night. George St. Pierre would fly down, train with you. Guys that want to get great, they go and make it happen.
Yes. When George started, he was a garbage man. He would take the bus from Montreal, that's 6 hours, to New York on Friday nights and train with us Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and then take the bus back home. And when you want something badly, you'll find a way to make it happen. And,
well, I mean, I was past my prime, but I liked your innovation. So I moved across the country because I wanted to study jiu-jitsu for a little bit because I love the art. So it's like, if you want to make something happen, you make it happen. Don't make excuses. I think people should realize that. But yeah, no, I'd love to see Gary fight again soon. So yeah, your team's actually, the team fell apart. We won't get into that, but there was, you know, after COVID, everyone left New York. The team split in two, unfortunately. I think a lot of people already know this, but it's, I'm really impressed with how fast you pulled the team back together.
Yes. There was a split in the team in Puerto Rico. We were in Puerto Rico training during the COVID era. And when we came back to the United States, I actually didn't want to go to Puerto Rico. My recommendation to the team was to go to Texas. They didn't want to be in New York, so I said we should go to Texas. We had a group vote, and the vote was decisively in favor of Puerto Rico. I was, interestingly, the only person who voted alongside me was, of all people, Nicky Rod.
Yeah, clearly that was a terrible idea when you guys moved out there.
So after Puerto Rico fell apart, we moved to Austin. That was originally the goal, and the other team members also went to Austin, Texas. So ironically, we ended up together. The team that had split it up ended up in the same city. And then there was a whole question of what do we do? I was actually going to just retire then. I thought, you know, we've done a lot, and the whole breakup thing was kind of sad, to be honest.
It's really depressing.
So I was thinking, you know, this is a good time to call it quits. And I was going to go back to New York, but at the time Gordon was very, very sick, and it wasn't clear that he was going to be able to compete. He was actually retired at that time. And in Austin, Texas, I was teaching at a local jiu-jitsu school, and I was there for a few months, and I said, you know, maybe I'll just stay here. And then some just remarkable people started coming in. A youngster from South Africa, Luke Griffith, came in. He was just a kid from South Africa who had competed and lost at the European ADCC trials. He came in and started training. John Calabadoni, who I knew from working in Boston for BJJ Fanatics, wanted to come down and train. Nicholas Merigali met, he met me originally, and then Gordon at BJJ Fanatics, and he expressed interest in switching from gi to no gi. A group of others came in, and we started this training at this local school at Roca, and everyone made remarkable progress. And then they were competing very well locally, and as time went by, I just stayed longer and longer, and we built up momentum. And then I thought, you know what, let's do another run for ADCC, and we ended up having an even more successful ADCC as a new team called New Wave than the previous ADCC that we were in when the team was together. So it was a remarkable turnaround in a very short period of time. And again, you had those same, I hate to sound repetitive to your audience, but it's that same idea of just immersion in jiu-jitsu, where people were coming in and learning huge amounts of information in a short period of time through this total immersion and technique, training twice a day, every day. And the results were there.
Yeah, I was really impressed with Nicholas. I came in, he was a world champion with no gi, but like
he was a champion in the gi.
Yeah, with the gi, that's what I meant. And I think he just started taking it off, and like he did not feel world championship no gi level to me at that point. I'm like, oh, this guy is not gonna. Did he win Abu Dhabi that first year? Like that,
he got a silver and a bronze, and
that was a short time period. Like his improvement was
crazy.
I came back 2 months later and trained with him. It was like a different person.
Yeah,
because I'm like, oh, this guy's all right. And then
shortly after ADCC, he went on to defeat by submission numerous ADCC champions. All no gi. What he did in the time available,
jump wasn't crazy.
Incredible.
When I first came, it was obvious that
when he first came in, he was getting tapped out by the blue belts and with leg locks, like just simple leg locking. And then just 4 or 5 months after that, he was a killer. And then since then, he's just taken off. But he's a fascinating person to coach. He's very emotional guy and very intuitive. Gordon's like coaching a mathematician, and Nicholas Miragali's like coaching a musician, like a Mozart. Mm-hmm. And they're very different psychologically. One's a very algorithmic thinker, and one's more of a heuristic thinker. And but both of them are incredible.
Yeah, like I said, because I mean, just the jump. I'd never seen anyone. Well, I guess Gordon too, but just how fast he got good so quick.
Yeah.
It was impressive to me. It was like shocking. Like, oh, this is not the same guy I trained with 3 or 4 months ago, whatever it was. And Luke too, man, he was like a tough guy that came over, and now I haven't trained with him in a while. He's huge now too. I don't know if I want to train with him anymore.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, look at him like, this guy's gotten too big and it looks too good. Did he win Abu Dhabi last year?
He got silver medal.
Oh yeah, but it was with
Felipe Pena.
Close match with an absolute legend. So he's right there too. It's like, you have all these world champions, and right next to world champions again, just like that.
Yes, no, it's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, because it was sad when the team broke up for me. I wasn't there. I went thinking, oh, maybe I could mediate things. I stopped by B team. I talked to Gordon, and I'm just like, oh, this is not happening. Yeah, I tried talking to the guys like, hey, can we patch this up? And it was just no.
Yeah,
you know how life goes sometimes.
I think when they get older, they'll patch things up pretty quickly. Like at the end of the day, they were friends much longer than they were apart from each other, and they got along great for so many years. And you know how guys are. When guys split up, sometimes you need the animosity to make the split happen more organically and naturally. It's like when you and George knew each other before. When you were fighting, if you got into a room together, it would have been pretty fucking awkward.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't be in the room with them.
Once you stopped fighting each other, you became best friends. Like I believe in the idea of that. We all have a lot more in common with each other than we do differences, and there's times when we focus on the difference, and that's when conflict happens. And then there's other times we step back. Usually, time is the factor which is involved here. You step back. There's time to reflect, and you realize we had a lot of good times together. There's a lot more similarities there. So I'm cautiously optimistic that time can cure most things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like I hated Mayhem for years, and I talked to him on the phone the other day because Rampage is like, just give him a call. I'm like, I'm like, you know what? Why not? Why do we hate each other? I couldn't even remember why we hated each other. I'm thinking like, wait, why do we hate each other? Okay, I'll call him. You realize how stupid it is.
You know things are bad when you can't remember the reason why you hate someone.
Yeah, he knew he hated me, and then you realize, wait, I know I hate this guy. Isn't it funny like that? So I just called him, and they were like laughing.
Yeah.
So And I would really like to see Gordon and Nikki, his brother, patch it
Yeah,
up.
of
It's like they're
course.
brothers,
Yeah.
and
Dude, they have a mother. How do you think she feels when she goes to sleep
that's
at night?
tough. Yeah, I really hope
It's
they.
got to be the worst feeling in the world, watching two sons not get along. The good news is they do talk now. They get along a lot better than they did previously. But I remember when I was a kid, I grew up with two brothers, and we used to fight every day. And but at the end of the day, you just hug and make up. It's like so. As I said, they were together much longer than they were apart. So I'm cautiously optimistic that time will cure most things.
Yeah, I think you're correct. Something we'll talk to you earlier today. I hadn't trained with you a while and came in, and I remembered you don't use round timers, and I'm so used to training on round timers, 5-minute rounds, and just that no round timer. Like, why do you do that? For one, it's for an athlete, it's hard for us to not see the time. So as a coach,
if you look at most athletic endeavors, they're always the boundaries are set by a clock. And if you look at the effect of the clock on the way the mind works, it's pretty interesting. There's an old cliche that always gets thrown around that if you throw a man into the ocean and you just fly off, he'll be dead in 3 minutes. But if you take that same man, you throw him into the ocean and you say, we'll be back in 24 hours to pick you up, he will find a way to survive. And he'll be there alive in 24 hours. What's the difference? Because time gives you hope. And as long as you have that hope, you'll fight. But if there's no hope, you'll just accept the situation and drown. Same thing when you put a clock on the wall. When you tell someone this is going to be a 5-minute round, if it's going badly for them, in their head, they're just saying one mantra, 2 minutes left, survive. And they'll fight all the way through to that 5 minutes and they'll survive it. But if you put two guys on the mat and you just say, just go, let's see what happens. If they feel that they're losing and they fall apart mentally, that's a sign of some kind of mental weakness. The only thing when you're not going to get saved by the clock that will save you is your technique. And so it creates a mindset in students where the only thing they know they can rely on is their own technique. They will learn the technique. But when they learn to rely on the clock to save them, the progress quickly dissipates.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like when I'm in shape is never a problem, but if I'm not in shape, you're like, oh crap, the clock, and it's not there. It can start messing with your head. It makes you think, oh, what do I do? And that's when you really better start relying on technique.
Yeah. And when your question is, what should I do? And you don't have the answer, it's a terrifying feeling. So what's your solution? Learn more.
Yeah,
work on skills.
Right. The goal of take a look at the clock. Oh, a minute. I could easily just coast through this.
Never see the clock as your salvation. See your technique and tactics as your salvation. So when you train without a clock, that's what you see.
Yeah, you also split. I already did a lot of when I walked in. You do a lot of things similar to how I do, which I love because it's a lot of things people say I'm not doing right. But then something I started copying when I teach now is you usually do like half of your rounds positionals, and I think that's great. Starting in bad positions, it makes
usually a lot more than half. Yeah.
Makes you better at finishing and escaping.
Yeah, most people. Let's say you have two athletes train with each other and sparring for 20 minutes. If you actually break down the activities of that 20 minutes, you will find that 3/4 of it is spent in neutral positions where the athletes really don't engage. They're looking for some kind of tactical advantage. And so out of a 20-minute sparring session, only 5 minutes is engaged in technique, which takes you through to a submission victory. If you start them in positional rounds, you start someone in a winning position, or from the other guy's perspective, a losing position, then you get the exact opposite. Now, 3/4 of the training time is spent in positions where you win or you lose. And so you create athletes who spend the vast majority of their training time in winning or losing positions. So they literally learn how to win, as opposed to how to engage or skirmish with their opponent. If you look at people who only spar in neutral position, they're skirmishers. They never learn how to dominate. They never learn how to control someone in potentially match winning positions and get the job done. So I always have my students start in positions where you can either win a match or lose a match. And that's where the vast majority of their training is done. And then that takes down the problem of neutral skirmishing and reduces the amount of time wasted in those situations.
Yeah, things like mount escape, for example. I so rarely got mounted before I trained with you that my mount escape wasn't that good. Now, putting him on a mount, other than like Gordon, I can usually just blow him right off.
Everyone, the progress everyone manifests is directly related to the time they spend in those situations. If you look at, for example, I've seen people like Gordon or Nicholas get mounted on world-class opponents. And if you look at those world-class opponents, once Gordon or Nicholas gets mounted on them, they look like they've never done a mount escape in their life. And the reason for that is simple, because they probably haven't done a mount escape in the last 15 years. They're so good that when they work out with their friends, no one ever gets mounted on them. So then that one day it does finally happen, they find to their horror that they're no more experienced at getting out of the mount than the white belts in the class. So they just don't practice it. You're only as good as what you practice. Like, you're a direct reflection of the sophistication and the amount of time you spend in those positions. And if you haven't spent any time there and you got no sophistication, you're not getting out. And you'll see many times Gordon and Nicholas get mounted on people who they're very good, but they don't look good in those positions simply because they've never been exposed to them in the last 15 years. The last time someone got mounted on them, they were probably a white belt. Whereas with my students, literally every single day, they start in the worst positions in the sport and the best positions. So they know how to win from the best positions, and they know how to avoid losing in the worst positions.
Yeah, something I'm really impressed with Gordon. He's able to put his ego away. Like one time, a lot of times, people would be like, "Oh, I did good with Gordon," and a big guy I tapped like 10 times, so I know he didn't really do good with Gordon. But one time I saw him with a top athlete. He let this guy put him in his best move. The guy ended up actually tapping Gordon first. He puts him there again. I think Gordon eventually got out. He has to put him there 4 or 5 more times, and Gordon's just escaping like that. And then you see the guy realize he's the one that just got played. At first, he's like, "Oh, I tapped Gordon," and then it's like, "Wait a second, Gordon just downloaded my best move and can escape at ease." And just remember watching that, being like, "Wow, that was Gordon just played this guy."
Most people approach sparring in terms of winning and losing. They say, "I beat that guy." That's their mindset. You either won the sparring round or you lost the sparring round. Now, that's good to build, like, match preparation, mental toughness. I'm not saying these things are worthless. They have a value. But for me, the most valuable attribute or the most valuable way in which you can use sparring time is in terms of experimentation. And you have to use sparring to experiment. Where are your weaknesses? Where are your strengths? What needs to be changed? So when you see someone who's particularly strong at a given move, that's an opportunity to experiment. And if, let's say, he has a phenomenal guillotine, okay, well, let's test our guillotine defenses. Let's put our head into the hornet's nest and see what happens. Let's test our ability to defend a guillotine versus his ability to employ one. And whenever you expose yourself to risks like that, of course, you're going to get submitted multiple times. It's going to happen a lot. That's why we put, very little weight on who gets tapped by who in the gym, because 9 times out of 10, it's an experiment that they're looking at. And now, if you're engaged in, pre-ADCC training where it's a competitive round starting in a neutral position where you're simulating a match, well, then you'll see the A game, and then you'll see who the best guy in the gym is.
Yeah, I think it's important what you just said, like if you're doing, it's good to experiment, but certain days you go in there and you're not experimenting, and make sure you're very clear those days you're battling. And you would do that sometimes. We'd have days where you'd go in, you'd actually separate the good guys together. Sometimes we'd be training together too much, and you'd be like, no, get some easy rounds. Yeah. Then we'd come in on the weekends when hardly anyone was there, and sometimes we would just only good people and just battle. Some rough days. It's just like every round, it's just going to be a killer session.
Yeah, no, it's tough when you've just had what you thought was like the toughest round of the week, and then your next sparring partner is Gordon Ryan.
Yeah, right.
You're just like, are you
some
fucking
tough days
kidding me,
training
bro?
for Abu Dhabi.
Yeah. So, but that kind of training is what creates very tough competitive athletes too.
Yeah, it's Sunday morning, and you got to train with like Nicky Rodriguez, Gordon Ryan, Gary Tone, and you're looking at the mats being like, why do I do this? There's not even very much. Well, now there's money in jiu-jitsu finally.
Yeah, that's a positive thing. And but yeah, back when you started jiu-jitsu, there was literally zero money in it. You actually paid to compete, and so I'm happy to see the athletes are getting much better compensation today than they were back in the day.
Yeah, it's nice. And someone like you who's coaching has finally made some money, which is nice because you've been doing it for a long time, probably less than you would have made in a lot of careers with how intelligent you are.
Mhm.
So it's nice to see. But interesting though that now that you've been successful, you still train beginners all the time. I find that I think it's
Yes.
awesome you do, but I find that a little it's not the standard.
Yeah. To me, the real magic of jiu-jitsu is the feeling you get when you're a beginner learning things. My fondest memories in jiu-jitsu is when I was a white belt, watching my teacher show technique where it was just like mind
Yeah,
blowing
right.
to us. It's like, wow, this is crazy. They've thought of everything. Um, and I always want to be able to reproduce those feelings for people coming new into the sport. You saw today, you came
Yeah.
to the class at Roka, which is professional
Right.
athletes, and then you went to the class at Renzo Gracie, which is just regular people going out to learn
Yeah.
jiu-jitsu, people with jobs. They come in after work. And I teach both. Most people think that I only teach like
The
professional
pros, yeah, no.
athletes, but for me, as rewarding as it is to coach professional athletes, to watch someone who works as an accountant and previously believed they couldn't win a fight against anyone, and now they literally go against someone who's physically much more imposing than them, and through the application of technique, skill, and strategy, overcome someone that 6 months ago they never would have stood a chance against, and that's a tremendous thing.
Yeah, honestly, once you started having your DVDs out, I thought you were going to stop teaching beginners, and I'm still with the beginners classes. That's show
Yeah.
you how much you love the sport. And people watching, you have the DVDs on BJJ Fanatics. You have a whole series of, I mean, it's a little advanced. Do you have beginner series on
Oh
there?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you have amazing DVDs on there. So but you're still out teaching every day.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, it shows that you true love. Because I'm looking at like for me, I'm like, oh, I wouldn't be training these beginners. It can be tough. It can be frustrating when you're so advanced because it takes a long time to map out what's going on. It takes
Yeah.
almost a year to even have any understanding of what's going on.
My students are they're angels. They put up with my horrible personality and my lack of patience. So God bless them. But we all get along, and at the end of the day, everyone realizes that there's something we cherish, jiu-jitsu. There's a vision that everyone has that in the future, if they work hard and employ sound training methods, that they can get to a level of skill which they've set as their goals. And even if you work a full-time job, you may not be the next Gordon Ryan, but you're going to be pretty damn good. And people are often shocked by how good
you have some good students that weren't known for the first time coming to your gym. Like
people
who's this
who work
nerd?
regular jobs. You think you go with some guy that no one's ever heard of. He can be a nightmare to
like
go against.
Brian
Glick, he's a classic example.
savage.
You look at Brian, you'd think he would never done jiu-jitsu in his life, but I mean, he's wrecked people who are very highly regarded.
Probably high-level UFC pros, I'd imagine. For sure, I've seen it. Just wrecking these guys.
Yeah. So then there's so many cases like that. Like jiu-jitsu it's a remarkable thing, and it can transform people. And as I said, it can give you a set of skills which can absolutely shock even a professional athlete. I've always said, Jake, the real measure of a coach is not who his best students are; it's who his average students are.
Interesting.
The real measure of a coach is measured not by the best athletes, but by the overall quality of the room that he coaches. The thing I'm most proud of isn't, the biggest accomplishments of my best students. The thing I'm most proud of is that every room I ever coached was tough. Like you can go with a random dude at Renzo's in New York back in the day. Some guy, as a professional, you can get matched up with some guy who looks like he's 45 years old, looks like he just came off the night shift at the local Irish bar, and that guy will give you one hell of a match. And you're like, damn, who the fuck was this guy? Oh, and then you go over the next guy, shake hands with him, and you get another tough match. And these are people who just no one's ever going to know their name.
No, it's true.
But that's how you see a coaching program works. Someone like Gordon would have been great no matter who he was coached by. George St. Pierre would have been great.
Better. They're both better under you, but they would have been great regardless.
They would have been great regardless.
They would have probably still won a world title, but they wouldn't have been as good.
But the as I said, the real measure is when you look at the room overall, and when the whole room is strong, then the ones who are strongest in a strong room, they're going to be exceptional. Okay, anyone could be strong in a weak room, but when the whole room is strong, and then you're incontestably the best guy in that strong room, then you're something special. So make the room strong, and then those outstanding people that have whatever attributes tend to propel them towards greatness will become even stronger.
Something I've noticed, or what I observed, I felt like you were always very much geared towards the best person in the room, and then everyone else had to kind of keep up. And you also kind of expected the other good guys to kind of help people underneath them. Is that kind of a correct observation?
Yes, it is. First off, everyone I teach them not only to be an athlete, but to be a teacher as well. The second big thing that I'm proud of with my students is that I never had a great student who was a lousy teacher. All of them were outstanding teachers as well as athletes. I've always been very proud of that. And in the room, when we all work, once they start drilling together, you'll see the more experienced students, they work as seniors and they guide the juniors, the apprentices. And there's like this synergistic effect where their knowledge goes out and they go to work. This is, I think, a very, very important thing. In my experience, my jiu-jitsu got so much better when I started teaching, and it forces you to think and reason about what you're doing. And so I teach all of my students not just to be athletes, but to be good teachers as well. I've always been very proud of that. There was a second thing that you wanted to discuss.
What was it? What did they say? You have expected the guys that, basically it raises everyone up. You have them help teach guys underneath them.
Yes. I'm a big believer in coaching to the smartest person in the room, the most knowledgeable person in the room, I should say, the highest level person in the room. And my take on this is most people want to be lifted up. And if you put some people in a room where the most gifted are being focused on, they could be intimidated by this, and they got two choices. You can either leave and go somewhere else, or you can work hard and lift yourself in a similar vein. And I've always believed you get better results for the room overall when people have an aspirational mindset where their goal is to rise to the level of the best people, rather than a mindset where I focus on the people who are the least gifted and coach to the person who's really struggling, because it will create a room where the most gifted people become bored and they will leave. When the most gifted people in the room leave, you've got no role models. If you go into a room and you see 10 people who are just unbelievably good at jiu-jitsu, they become unconsciously or consciously role models to you. You're like, I want to be like them. But if you look around the room and there's no one in there that's good, you're just going to be like, you don't even see the possibilities of what jiu-jitsu can do. You're like, and then when it gets tough, you'll leave because there's nothing aspirational to look up to. And so I coach to the best people on the understanding that they will create a vision that even the lowest person in the room can look up to and see as something that's a vision that they could see themselves becoming part of, so that the gaze goes upwards rather than downwards.
Yeah, I think some people would sometimes view it like, oh, like John's cold, ignoring us. But I think you nailed it. You were trying to bring them up because you cared about them and wanted to be great. So you were shooting here, not down here.
Show me a room full of people with no role models to work with, and I'll show you a group of people that'll never make serious progress. And when they run into adversity, they'll leave because they don't have a vision of what's possible in a beneficial way for the future. But if someone believes, man, if I stick through this and if I work hard, I can become like that guy.
Yeah, you also had the expectation of the other guys that were good to help. I don't think you really expressed that to us, but it was pretty clear. Like, we'd come to Gordon and ask him for questions, like Nicky Rodriguez. He was every day with Gordon afterwards, asking questions. You expected the guys under you to also help.
Yeah. No, you want to create that culture where there's people that everyone looks up to. And it's a very, very important thing.
Yeah, so like you don't have time for everyone's questions, but they could come to Gary,
people,
me.
On an average class in Renzo's in New York, it was between 80 to 100 people. Like I can't physically go to all 100 people. So the question becomes, well, which people do you go to? Do you go to the people who are struggling, the ones who are the least gifted in the room? You could take that route. I'm not saying that's wrong.
And a lot of coaches do, but the rooms don't rise to what yours does.
Yeah. Then the ones who are gifted are going to leave. And then when they leave, then even the ungifted ones will say, well, why would I even do the sport? Like, no one here's any good and doesn't really seem that inspirational. Like, if it gets tough, I'm just going to quit. Whereas when they see something which strikes them as something which is truly desirable, they're going to be like, I want to be like that. Then they will stick through thick and thin.
I think it's an amazing strategy. I've just heard a few people criticize it over the years there, but I think it was a great. Switching subjects real quick. When Gary first started doing MMA, he was smaller than me and brand new. And you made him spar me for 5 rounds, 25 minutes, multiple times in a row. What was your logic?
My logic was that you were predominantly a grappling MMA fighter, so that it would be relatively safe. You're not going to, you weren't going to knock him out. Like, when you switch to MMA training, your biggest fear as a coach is the idea of brain damage. That doesn't really exist in jiu-jitsu. But in MMA, it's a real problem. So you were a fascinating training partner for him because first you had fought at the highest levels.
Yeah, so you put him right in.
Yes. So Gary was already a very good grappler. You were a good grappler. And so that was a chance for him to do high-level MMA very early in his career with someone who was safe. Now, I would never have done that if the high-level MMA guy was, say, Anderson Silva.
Like someone that's trying to knock him out and stuff. Plus, Gary was my friend.
Yeah,
but
that would make no sense. So, so you could go very hard in MMA sparring, but it would be entirely safe. And because Gary was already a very good grappler, even though it was MMA, it was mostly MMA grappling. So it gave him very early in his career a sense of, okay, what's the difference between just jiu-jitsu grappling versus MMA grappling? Because they are significantly different.
Yes, you wanted him to see the big difference, and he jumped it up quick. I know those first few sessions were rough for him, but then he did make it. He adapted really quick.
Yes.
So no, it makes sense. Throw him right at the high level, so you can realize it is a lot different. Sometimes guys don't realize the first time doing I got this down.
Oh yeah.
I think nowadays sport jiu-jitsu has veered quite a far away from mixed martial arts.
Yeah, anytime you get extreme specialization, that's always a risk, and you always have to ask yourself, what is my purpose in going into jiu-jitsu? Like when you started, it was fighting.
Yeah.
When I started, it was self-defense. I was working as a bouncer. But nowadays, I think many people enter jiu-jitsu just as a sport in and of itself. And I know there's kind of like an argument amongst people who mostly are my age, I have to say, who say, modern jiu-jitsu sucks. These guys, if they ever got in a fight, they would get killed. Okay, let's get a couple of things squared away here. First, in terms of just pure jiu-jitsu, I truly think that the modern generation of jiu-jitsu was significantly better than, say, for example, my generation. And in a jiu-jitsu match, they would annihilate them. Now, the counter argument many people make is that, well, yeah, that might be true, but in an actual fight, these guys would get wrecked. My counter to that is listen, no one would be so naive. No modern jiu-jitsu athlete would be so naive that if they got into a real fight, they would, roll into legs underneath someone and do this kind of thing. No, they wouldn't do that in a street fight. They would just use
hopefully
basic technique of, arm drag, get behind them, trip them, get on top and hit them and then strangle them. So I don't think that, the modern generation of athletes would somehow be defenseless in a fight. And also to be completely square about this, I would also say that most modern jiu-jitsu athletes, especially of the last 5 years, are significantly better in takedown and standing position than the athletes of my generation, where we did almost no standing training. You had the benefit of being a wrestler. But 99% of jiu-jitsu athletes of the 1990s had no wrestling background and couldn't take down someone to save their life. They relied on the other person taking them down and then working from guard, or fighting a karate guy who had even worse takedown defense than their takedowns. So I do think that modern athletes are much more well-rounded than they're given credit for. They have better takedowns. They have excellent top control. Look at the evolution of Gordon Ryan. Like, when he first arrived, he was a leg lock guy from bottom. Then he was a leg lock guy from bottom who also had good back attacks. And then he switched completely mid-career to a top pressure player who did most of his best work from mounted position. That was an evolution over time and shows what's possible. And jiu-jitsu tends to follow its role models, and most young athletes today are very strong in leg locks. They're very competent in bottom position, but they also have a good pressure passing game. They're very good in these top positions, and they can put people down. And they're going to do just fine in a fight, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the stuff that doesn't work could be adapted quick.
Absolutely.
I do think it's pulled apart a little bit, but it could be adapted.
I mean, most people who are doing funky entries into leg locks know that, okay, I'm using this because I'm in a jiu-jitsu match. Like, I wouldn't try this if, I was in a fight in a nightclub. Like, they're not fools. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think a lot of these criticisms maybe are a little unfair.
That makes sense. So with the as far as your moves, you go back to the Japanese name. Is that just to respect from where the art comes from? Or?
Like people make a big issue of names for moves, and I know I've copped a lot of flack over this for years. I don't care what names you give to the moves. What I do care about is that you do have names. When you look at expertise in any aspect of human life, it's almost always manifested by the ability to make more fine-grained distinctions than most people in that area. So, for example, if you look at snow, to you and I, snow is snow. But to someone who works in an alpine ski resort, they'll talk about the difference between different kinds of powder snow. If you talk to someone who lives in Alaska, like
it's a snowboard, so the snow is quite different to me.
A data person, they might have many different words for snow, depending on, for us, snow is snow, but for him, there might be 20, 30 different varieties of snow. So for us, we don't know anything about snow. We barely see snow. But to someone who makes their living in snow, they might have 30 or 40 different words for it. They're, as it were, manifesting their expertise, their knowledge through language. And they can make more fine-grained distinctions between different kinds of snow, and that reflects their expertise. Because to them, whether it's this kind of snow or that kind of snow might mean the difference between living or dying if you're out there in the wilderness. Okay, and someone like me, snow.
For me, just snowboarding, I want a certain type of powder, so I know, so I understand a little bit your analogy.
So it makes a difference to performance, and so think about a situation where you have two people trying to repair a car engine. If I say to you, "Hey Jake, throw me that cylindrical thing with the gray bottom and the white top," you're like, "What?"
Yeah, there's a lot of tools like that.
But if I say to you, "Jake, throw me the spark plug,"
yeah,
you know exactly what to reach for.
We're talking about before. I'm thinking, Ratchet, what the hell are you trying to talk about?
We can communicate quickly, and we can get work done quickly and efficiently because we're working with language now. So whenever you want to think like an expert on a subject, a big part of it is making fine-grained distinctions. So you have to be able to have a precise nomenclature for all your terms, okay? People talk about a heel hook. Okay, well, what kind of heel hook? Is it an inside heel hook or is it an outside heel hook? Is it a figure four hold or is it a reverse figure four? And someone who's highly conversant with the topic can follow instructions very, very quickly. They can be programmed through language to act in certain ways. If I see a situation unfolding and I go left figure four, my student can follow that in a second and apply it in a match situation. So again, it makes a difference to performance, and that's ultimately what it all comes down to. Can you improve performance? If a distinction is just arbitrary and doesn't improve performance, then ignore it. Now, your question is, why do we use Japanese terms? Well, I do think that the massive input of the Japanese into modern jiu-jitsu has been greatly undersold. Like, we call it Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but it was first a Japanese art. They figured out a lot of things. They gave us a lot of technology. Yeah. The Brazilians did an amazing job of going with that. But a lot of the fundamental techniques were Japanese, and I try to honor them. When some moves are just obviously Brazilian in origin, like a berimbolo. Of course, it makes sense to call it a berimbolo. It's a Brazilian who invented the move, and it doesn't seem to have been part of the Japanese framework at all. There's times when I don't use Japanese words. For example, the American lock. Why do I call it American? Well, the Americanas, the Brazilian term. Why don't I call it urigarami like the Japanese? Well, it's too close phonetically to ashigarami. So if I'm in a crowded amphitheater calling for a move and I'm calling ashigarami, there can't be if my student can't hear because there's a noisy crowd and he thinks I'm calling for urigarami when I'm actually calling for ashigarami, there's going to be a problem. So phonetically they're too close. So I don't use the traditional Japanese word when there's a potential problem that would lower performance. But where I can, I try to show respect to the people who gave us this incredible art. And the Japanese were a big part of it. The Brazilians were a massive part of it. Now some of the young Americans are becoming a big part of it. Now you get Australians, Europeans who, and if they come up with their own words, I'll use their words. So I show respect where I can, but I'm also a realist. If I think that using the term is going to cause problems or lower performance, then I'll stick with another term. There are some terms that simply only my students seem to have used these. So we have our own unique terms. So, I'm not hard and fast. I'm not some crazy traditionalist. Everything has to be given a Japanese name. No, I'm not like that. I show respect where it's due, but I'm not hard and fast. But what I do insist on is that for every move you do have terms so that you think about the game in a different way, in a very precise, ordered fashion, which you can relate to other people so you can make them better as well as you. And as the overall level of the room goes up, your level will go up with it. The old cliche is that all boats on a rising tide will rise. So as students can communicate to each other with more precision, they can apply moves with more precision. And the precision of your moves is directly related to the precision of your thinking about the moves. And as your language becomes more precise, your thinking becomes more precise. Just as instead of giving you some half-muted instruction about hand me something that looks like that, I can say, Jake, hand me the spark plugs. Okay. Now we have a common language and we can communicate rapidly and clearly, and our task of getting the engine reconstructed is going to be much faster and more efficient.
That was an excellent explanation. Well, good. So I know you study all different martial arts. Do you study a lot of martial arts history as well?
Actually, no. I know very little about martial arts history. There's some fascinating stuff out there, and sometimes students bring me just very, very interesting material on Japanese jiu-jitsu, the links between judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, catch wrestling. That's a whole fascinating topic. I'm no expert in them. I'm not really a martial arts history buff.
All like
I take it in, and I'm not completely illiterate on these. I know the basics of of the history of judo and jiu-jitsu, but it's not something I don't immerse myself in its history. My main thing is performance, and I only study history to the degree where I think it can help me increase performance.
Yeah, I remember one day I came in and someone, I can't remember who, they were asking you questions about different boxers, and you were able to break down their defensive, offensive. I was watching you break it down, and I was extremely impressed. Like all these different boxers, you fully understood like how they're, like Floyd Mayweather's defense versus someone else's and their offensive attacks. I'm like, wow, this is pretty impressive just off the top of your head.
Yeah, it's these people are incredible athletes, and they're so gifted. And there's so much for a student of mixed martial arts to learn from them. And so, I've been fascinated by boxing since I was a child. And whenever if I'm not studying jiu-jitsu, I'm probably studying boxing or wrestling or judo, some other martial art. And they have so much to offer, jiu-jitsu.
I remember, I don't watch hockey often, but I was watching a hockey fight the other day and how the guys curled. And I remember some hockey guy came in and was asking questions, and you were actually even showing him how to grab the jersey, how to turn, how to move it. And I watched the fight. And I'm like, oh, that's what John was showing. Memory just popped back in my head.
Yeah, there's it's actually quite a fascinating study watching hockey fights, because people think it's kind of random, but there's
never watched it. I was
watching
it. That memory just popped back in my head of you showing this guy. I'm like, oh, that's what John was showing this guy.
I was interested in it because when I worked as a bouncer, a lot of people grab clothing, and a lot of street fights turn into something like a hockey fight. So it was always interesting to me.
Yeah, and you even study animal fights. I remember you
Yes.
watching animal fight videos. Crazy place.
Yes. But, animal fights have that same idea behind mixed martial arts of contrasting styles interacting with each other. That was like nowadays, most of the athletes are pretty well-rounded. But in the early days of mixed martial arts, you had these extreme situations where totally different arts were matched against each other. And it had something in common with animal fights. So, what happens when a tiger fights against an antelope, and or against a water buffalo, and these are it's a similar theme to the early days of MMA.
Do you think I could take a ram in a fight?
This is a ram. I think that ram would take you right off your feet, hot shot.
Yeah, I was hiking and stumbled across some rams. I was thinking I could take it, but then
they're surprisingly aggressive. They even just the billy goat will just fearlessly charge. And
I stumbled across some rams were fighting. I was trying to figure out if I could take them, and then at the time I was feeling confident, but looking back, that ram would have launched me off the cliff.
I'm not going to say it's impossible.
In a cage, maybe, not in the cliffs. I wouldn't want to fight them.
In general, humans don't do well when they go up against wild animals. There's not many exceptions to that rule.
Yeah, I was looking at the horns, trying to figure out if I could take it, but I'm not sure. But yeah, the interesting world of animal fights. So let's go back to something practical. What's your take on CGI? I know, unfortunately, you and Craig had a little falling out, but I thought it was a great show.
Yeah. No, it was a fantastic show. They did an incredible job. In addition, not only did they do an incredible job, they did an incredible job against all the odds. Like the show wasn't even conceived until a relatively short time before it was put in place. Now, you ask anyone who's ever put on even a local martial arts show, just some show in a local high school gymnasium, it's tough. You got to do a lot of work. You got to, got a lot of little bureaucratic things done. And to put on an international level show, I think they had like 3 or 4 months to get it ready. Wow. It's not long at all. And to get it that good on the first attempt it was impressive.
That was really good.
The camera work was great. The pit that they took from Karate Combat worked really well. The heavyweight division was supposed to be Victor Hugo versus Nicky Rod. Victor Hugo got eliminated very early, so the heavyweight wasn't quite as dramatic, but the lighter weight division had some
stacked
epic fights. And
there was who was that epic match? It was Tackett versus
young Andrew Tackett took on he had many good fights, but it was against Cade Ruotolo.
Yeah, that was one of the best matches I've seen.
It was a great match, and both those guys put on an amazing show. And there were other great fights too, like the young Australian fellow Levi Jones Larry. He had an amazing tournament. Like so many talented people, especially in that lightweight division, and they captured it well on camera. They had excellent camera work, and they put on a fantastic show. There's no getting around that.
Yeah, I'm hearing rumors there's going to be another one. So hopefully you guys will be in that, because I'm sure everyone wants to see that.
Yeah, no, I think the whole world's looking forward to round 2. They did an amazing job.
Yeah, no, that's good that you can praise them despite, the falling out and stuff, but you can admit that was a great show.
The odd thing is we never actually had a falling out.
It was with him and Gordon, really, huh? Yeah, you were never, it was all between the guys more than you. You kind of got dragged into it.
Yeah, I could read you a text that he sent, was his last text he sent to me, and you'll see that there was no falling out. But whatever happened after that, you'd have to ask Craig. But yeah, hats off to him. He put on an amazing show. He obviously hired good people to help him. You can't do that alone, obviously. The cameraman did great work. The event organizers did great work. The athletes did phenomenal work. And he did something which is very, very laudable, which is to get financial compensation directly to the athletes. Of course, everyone's going to criticize in terms of, well, only one guy got paid. Well, it
was $1 million payday for grappling, which is for the sport.
That's a very significant thing. That's a big deal.
Big movement forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, hats off to him. Did an amazing job. Got a great team together in a short amount of time, and put on a great show.
Yeah. What's your thoughts of Mikey Musumeci?
Very talented guy. He's world champion in the gi, and very well credentialed in no gi as well.
Yeah, extremely innovative as well.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys always coming up with new stuff and pushing innovation as well.
Yeah, he's a very intelligent young man. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of really intelligent people in jiu-jitsu. Sometimes a little bit off, but there's a lot of intelligent people in the sport, the high level.
What you find is that there's intelligent people in all combat sports, but intelligence gets expressed in very different ways. Like, for example, one of the most interesting people I met was during the Ultimate Fighter show that George did with Josh Koscheck. And one night, George called in Mike Tyson to give a speech to the young athletes, the tough fighters. And he gave a speech. He actually he watched one of the fights, and he came into the locker room and he talked to us all for a very long time. He's a very, very nice person. He's a legend. He didn't need to come in and talk to us. He came and spoke with no compensation for like 2 hours. And there's a sense in which, if you listen to a speech, I could see some people dismissing what he said because he didn't sound classically smart in terms of his choice of words or what have you. But he was one of the most insightful people I've met in martial arts. He was very, very intelligent in his own way. And was he always able to express it perfectly? Of course not. He spent a limited amount of time in school. But just because your vocabulary isn't perfect, or just because you don't sound school smart, doesn't mean you're not smart. It just means that you express it with whatever vocabulary you have. But the insights he gave were some of the most memorable that I've seen among any of the extraordinary people I've met in martial arts. Just a very, very deep person, and but without being classically well-spoken in the normal sense that we associate with intelligent people, someone, a university professor or something like this. But Floyd Mayweather, another example, would you say that he was like highly literate? No, but he's very, very intelligent, and he knows his craft in a way. He's like a Da Vinci of boxing. So there's very intelligent people, but we tend to oversimplify intelligence in terms of how well spoken someone is. And but there's different ways to express intelligence than just that.
Yeah, no, I strongly agree with both of those guys, especially Tyson. I've listened to a lot of his interviews, and like I say, he doesn't word it in the best way, but he clearly has a deep understanding.
Very, very deep. And he was very impressively learned in his craft. Like he was talking to us about great figures of boxing. His coach, Customado, used to make him watch video of boxers, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of boxing. Like, he would talk to us about fighters like Harry Grebe. Like, if you don't study boxing, no one knows who the fuck Harry Grebe is. You have to know a lot about boxing to know who that guy is. That's from a long time ago. And he would talk about, his game and how it influenced him. And this guy was an encyclopedia of boxing knowledge. And so, knowledge is always domain specific. Like, I have some competence in jiu-jitsu, but I'm a moron outside of that. You try to get me to drive an automobile or do basic things like that. I'm terrible.
You lived in New York for so long. You were learning to drive last time I was out here.
Like,
just get one city. You don't need a car.
Yeah. So I have, some competence in one area, but outside of that, I'm pretty much freaking useless.
You're pretty knowledgeable on a lot of subjects, but
and so Tyson's knowledge of boxing would put him at the absolute top of that category. And but people tend to dismiss some fighters' intelligence in terms of, well, they don't talk about socioeconomic problems or politics or economics as well as other people. But that doesn't mean they don't know their own subject matter in an encyclopedic fashion. And just because someone can't talk to you about Renaissance history doesn't mean they're not very, very smart. And I was very impressed by some of the combat athletes that you meet. They're very, very insightful people.
Yeah, I only met Mike Tyson once, but I met him. I came in Renzo Gracie's one night, and he's sitting there watching us work out with like Cody Nolev, I think, brought him in. It was so cool to be like, sitting there watching, and Tyson's watching us work out.
Isn't it amazing how there's some people you can just take one look at them and you can understand why they're a star.
Yeah.
Like Mike Tyson had like this
aura.
An aura to him. You see it in certain people, like Rickson Gracie. Interesting.
He watched me and Crone work out one time. He was sitting there watching, and it was like so surreal that Rickson's just sitting there and watching me and his son train. I was just thinking that's what's funny with Tyson.
Yeah.
Those are one of those weird moments.
There's just certain
crazy.
people you just see.
Rickson just watching it was so weird.
And it's not just in our industry. I remember when I worked in nightclubs, I met people like Tupac and Biggie Smalls, and they had that same kind of aura. You could see that they had some kind of gravitas to them that made them stand out in the crowd. And we tend to romanticize, but there is something there. There is something. And,
no, I definitely agree. It's funny you mentioned Rickson. I was literally just thinking that when you said that. I remember in the time that me and Crone trained, it felt so weird with him just watching us. Something one part Crone must go through as a kid, having him always just staring, watching training. And it was a no time limit training session. We were training for like a long time with him just watching.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What year was that?
Time flies. Probably like 6 years.
Because I remember Crone was with you that night in Montreal. It was when Nick Diaz fought George. I think it was you and Crone in Nick's corner.
Yeah, he was coming in a lot, training with us for a year or two. But I haven't seen him in a while. I moved to Montana, and I don't think he has a whole MMA team, but still extremely talented guy.
Yeah. No, he had great jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, we're doing this interview late at night, so I'll just one or two more questions and we'll wrap up. Something I wanted to touch on real quick. You're absolutely fascinated by like swords and knives. Where does that come from? Like you have some of the most expensive, coolest, sharpest swords.
Yeah. I've always believed that the blades are a great metaphor for what everyone does in martial arts. And that metaphor operates in different kinds of ways. Like if you look at steel, it begins its life as iron ore in the ground or in riverbeds. And when you look at iron ore, there's nothing about it that would suggest that it could be made into steel, let alone a blade. It just looks like a clumpy, earthy object that looks like it has no potential whatsoever. And yet, through the process of forging, which in itself is a very brutal process of, it takes extreme knowledge and extreme hard work. It can be worked over time into steel, and that steel can be worked and refined ultimately into a blade, and then that blade can be sharpened and polished, and it become a sword or a knife. And when you look at the beginning, the iron ore, and then the polished blade at the end, there's almost no resemblance. And the martial artist goes through that same process. When you first walk in the door, like I did, you know nothing. You're a complete ignoramus. And the lowest guy in the gym can beat the piss out of you. But through this process of forging, of hard work, knowledge, skill, you can become something at the end where you become this sharpened blade. And just like a blade, it's morally neutral. The blade can be used for good, to save innocent lives, or it can be used for murder. It can be a terrible thing. Just like your martial arts skills. They can be used to make you a better person. They can be used to make you a worse person. They're neutral. You will decide how they get used. And so this idea of the transformative element and then the neutrality element and how you choose to use this power you've been given, I think they're well captured by this idea of the blade. And so when my students do something notable, I usually give them a blade as a memory of that experience. So I think it works on this kind of metaphorical level where the students see the blade and daily they're reminded of this idea of transformation over time, and this idea that knowledge and skill with hard work can change you from something unremarkable to something truly remarkable. But once you get that remarkable gift, there's a responsibility that comes with it. And it can either make your life something good and worthy, or it could make you a menace, depending on how it's used.
Yeah, and you've watched and helped forge, George St. Pierre, who a lot of people say is the greatest fighter of all time, and then Gordon Ryan, who a lot of people say is the greatest jiu-jitsu guy of all time. So you've helped forge these men, and in my opinion, they're both great guys. That must be a interesting process.
Yeah, no, but again, that goes back to they were both incredible people, and not just them, but so many of my students were. When I look back, it's I have the deepest admiration for them, and they went through a lot, all of them, and.
Do you think they became better men as they started getting better at their arts?
Almost all of them, yes. It's I think ultimately who we are as people is often set before we get into martial arts, and then like any form of power, it will increases in power will tend to manifest more clearly who you already are. Okay, they say that power corrupts, but really it doesn't. It just shows who you really are. And good people will become better people, and bad people will become worse people with power.
Yeah, and Gordon gets like his public persona sometimes like he's a prick, but really he's like, because even as he passed me up, he still treated me as a senior. It wasn't like, oh, I'm the best in the world now. And George St. Pierre, everyone obviously knows he's a great guy.
I think people tend to put way too much stock in social media as to right. their judgments of people. The truth is, if someone's just an awful person, no one wants to be around them. And when people stay together for many, many years, it's a pretty clear sign that they can't be that bad.
Yeah, Gordon's been such a good, loyal friend to me, and obviously as a student to you, he always praises you.
Yeah, no, he's been a blessing in many people's lives. And at the end of the day, I've taught a vast number of people over 30 years. Okay, there have been some people I've taught who are just awful human beings, and none of them became famous. None of them are my famous students, but they were just terrible people. And some of them ended up in jail, and they deserve to be there. And but they were a tiny fraction of the number of people who did. Most people, when they come into a room and they share hard work with like-minded people towards a similar goal, tend to reform themselves and work towards that common goal. And the truth is, if you're a complete jerk in a room full of competitive people who practice how to strangle people and break into people's arms,
someone's going to hurt you.
You're going to get your ass whipped at some point. And you can't be a completely awful person. You're going to run out of training partners. If you're the strongest guy in the room and you're an awful person, you can run out of training partners. If you're the weakest guy in the room and you're an awful person, you're going to get your ass whipped. If you're somewhere in between, you're going to get both of those effects. So jiu-jitsu does have kind of a reforming process over time. And if you can't be reformed, they just leave. They just go somewhere else.
I came in, I got my ass whipped and made me a better person. And then when guys come in the gym and they're a prick, I would whip their ass. Either don't come back or they come back a little humbled. You've seen that happen over and over.
Jiu-jitsu is very much a humbling experience. And, just think about the whole core of what jiu-jitsu is based on is submission. And there's a sense in which every time you submit, who are you really submitting to? Are you submitting to the person who submitted you?
To yourself.
You're submitting to the laws of physics, biomechanics, strategy, and tactics that enabled that person to submit you. We look at it like that guy submitted me, but no, that guy using physics, biomechanics, strategy, tactics beat me. If he didn't have that skill, he wouldn't have beaten me. So when I submit, I don't submit to you. I submit to jiu-jitsu. And that general sense keeps you pretty grounded. Like, you learn very quickly in jiu-jitsu that if you stop training, your skills are perishable. And that guy that you used to beat, now he's beating you every time. Mm-hmm. So you learn there's nothing special about you. It's not you that wins. It's your ability to apply knowledge, skill, technique. And if you don't keep that refined and polished, just like we talked about swords and blades. You don't keep polishing and oiling the blade, it'll rust. And your body will rust too, and your skills will rust. It's another reason why I like swords as a metaphor. But in this sense, jiu-jitsu is an intensely humbling experience. You think you're the best, and then you stop training. Well, now guess what? You're no longer the best.
And it's evolving. The sport's constantly evolving.
Yeah. So in this sense, it tends to expel people that are irredeemable, and it tends to humble and improve people who are redeemable.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all night, but I think this is probably a good place to wrap it up. We can do it another time, maybe in the future. Anything you want to add or anything you want to plug? I mean, you have the Academy, New Wave in the works. You have your BJ. We already mentioned the DVDs. Anything else you want to mention?
No, it's fine. It was a
Thanks so
pleasure
much, Jon.
talking to you, Jake.
Great.
It's good to see you after all this time.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.